Welcome to Tech Brothers. In this video, we're going to learn how to shrink database and database files. And there are a couple methods that we're going to use in order to accomplish this task. Number one is using SQL Server Management Studio graphic user interface. And number two, using T-SQL script. And the things that we're going to cover in this video, number one is shrinking database as a whole. Number two, shrinking database data file. Number three, shrinking database log files. And along the way, when we do all those three up here, database, data file, and log file, we'll be talking about when it is a good idea to shrink the database or the database files. So let's go and learn how to shrink the database. We're going to go ahead and go in. This is my SQL Server, and this is my SQL Server 2014 instance. TechBrothersIT is my machine name, and SQL Prod is my instance name. Here are the databases, and the database that we're going to work on, that we're going to shrink, is sales orders right here. In order to do that using graphic user interface, you need to right click on the database, go to task, and if you move your mouse to shrink option right here, you will get two options. One is database and other is file. So we're gonna first look at if we shrink the whole database. When you click on shrink the database, it brings you to up here a nice little screen, which is this is gonna shrink the database, basically data files. And it's gonna, if you read up here, it's gonna collectively, if you have more than one data file such as MDF and NDFs, and mostly in your organization, if you're working on a big database and you have multiple data files, what it's gonna do is it's gonna basically shrink all those data files all together based on the parameters that you have defined right here. A few options right here. Database currently allocated space is 5 MB. And again, available free space is 1.7 MB, 35%. When we talk about available free space, it goes back to your initial size of your database. Let's say that your data file is worth 5 MB, but you put initial size of that particular database 20 MB because you gave the room to grow the data in the beginning when you created the database. So it will show right here available free space. Right here is occupied space and available free space that's initially allocated to the database. And if it's 20 gig, then it's gonna show you right here is 15 MB is free. So in order to shrink the database as a whole, this is not a good idea. Again, as I said, that when we do the shrinking database, log file, or data file, we'll be talking about best practices. If you're working on production, it is never a good idea to shrink the database as a whole, because there are numerous reasons not to do it, but I'll be talking when we'll get to the database data file more detail about it. But in order to basically, you have an option to go ahead and shrink the database as a whole. So up here you see shrink action is reorganize files before releasing unused space. This will reorganize the files pages on the disk before it'll release basically the space that's available. If you wanted to, when it talk about releasing the space, it means that it is going to give that particular space that it is holding at the moment to operating system. And in that disk, if you see that it's a 1 gig disk, and after it releases occupied space, then you might see it's 1.5 gig free, just because it has released the space. So up here, the other option is maximum free space in files after shrinking. So what it means is if we have multiple database files, MDF, NDF, and we have given in the beginning all those NDF, MDF data files of that particular database, more space, initial more space than they basically need. But let's say that mistakenly you have given them in those MDF or LDF when you created the file groups and you created the file. Initial size of those files were enormous. You didn't intend to basically give that much space. So what you want is, you do want, out of 10 gig that you given, you want 5 gig to keep for each data file, and not the whole 10 gig. But when you when you free space, when you put up here free space in the files after shrinking, you want that 10% to each of those data files. Then you can go ahead and click on this option and say, okay, go ahead and keep the space that it needs plus the 10% of the space that is going to release. Don't release that above 10%. So you're going to go ahead and click up here 10%, 20%, however you wanted to do it. Again, I will never use this option in production system, but you have an option to do that. So all you need to do is give the percentage of the free space after reorganizing the unused space is going to keep the space it needs plus the 10% of the main space that it had. So you're going to go ahead and click OK, and it will shrink your database as a whole. And keep in mind, when you click on shrinking database, that is data files collectively, all the data files, MDF, all the NDF files that has related to that particular database, then it's going to shrink that. I'm going to go ahead and cancel this. All you need to do is basically just understand the concept of maximum free space in files, and also understand the concept of not using this option in production. Even though this option is available, I wish that Microsoft would take away this option, if you ask me, but this option is available, so you can use that, but I wouldn't recommend using that. But if you need to use this, this is how you use it. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel that, and we're going to go ahead, right click on the same database, go to task, go to shrink, and then we're going to go ahead and click on files. When we click on files, we get two options. Basically in 2014 you get three options, and I am not going to get into third option in this video, but you get data file and you get log file. If you click on files, as you can see right here in this little window, data file, and if you click up here, you get three options: data file, log file, and file stream data. I'm not going to get into file stream data. I'll cover it in a separate video, the file stream data, but data file and log file we're going to cover. So first thing, if you basically the recommended way that if you wanted to shrink, first of all, don't really try to shrink the data files of any database if you can help it. Now, the reason behind that is that if you try to basically shrink the data file, it increases the fragmentation on indexes and fragmentation of the database. That means that it's going to be very costly. The performance is going to go down, and if performance goes down in production, it is no good. So don't try to basically shrink the data file of any database. However, there are certain cases where you can shrink the data file, and sometimes it's a good idea to shrink the data file. And I will give you one scenario. Let's say that you have a 200 gig database, and there are 5 tables that each table is about 10 gig, and one of the table is about 40 gig. It's holding, one table is holding 40 gig worth of data, and that table is basically the historic table, and you have moved that table data somewhere else, and you wanted to basically go ahead and truncate that table so that 40 gig will be released. The 40 gig the space that that particular table was holding, it'll be available. So in that case, that if you have truncated that 40 gig table, then it's a good idea to do the data shrinking, data file shrinking. And if you wanted to do it, I also recommend to do it off hours. If you know that you have know for sure that you have truncated a large amount of data in the database, and you wanted to shrink the data so that it comes to a reasonable size, then it's a good idea at that time to do the data file shrinking. And you can go ahead, basically do it off hours so that it wouldn't affect. Keep in mind, when you do the data, even after 40 gig, you do the shrinking the data files is going to create some fragmentation, index fragmentation, and I will also recommend, after you shrink the data files, go ahead and rebuild your indexes or reorganize your indexes so that the fragmentation will be taken care of. That otherwise you might run into some performance issues. So let's go ahead and choose the data. This is just for the demo purposes, that how you wanted to do it. If you notice right here, the currently allocated space is 4 MB and available free space is 42 MB. I'll be talking about first option, shrinking action, is released unused space. This is again when I explained about shrinking the data base as a whole. When we click on this option, release unused space, let's say that you have allocated and I'll be doing this in just a second. Let's say that you have allocated initial size of this particular data, and that is 20 MB, and right now the data file is worth 4 MB. So how much free space do you have? 16 MB. So it is going to tell you available free space right here is 16 MB, and if you click on here, release unused space, it is going to basically make your initial size 4 MB and release all that 16 MB to operating system. So that's exactly what it means up here, release unused space. Basically, when you give initial size which is not being used, that is called unused space, or if you truncate the database, the data in certain tables, that become unused space as well. But keep in mind that this option is a little bit misunderstood in the community, because sometimes if initial size is set more than what it needs right now, there is a purpose for that, and I have explained in my first video that create database best practices, that it's a good idea to assess your database and basically give initial size more than at least 6 months or a year worth, so that it doesn't have to go back and forth and grab the more space, because everything gets halted in there. So let's let me show you real quick this demo, that what release space means. I'm gonna go ahead and cancel it and click on properties, go to files. Right now the initial size is 4 MB. I'm going to make it 20 MB, right? And we know that the database, the data is worth either 4 MB or 3 MB. So we're gonna go ahead and click on 20. So if you look at, go back to data right here, as you can see that it's 20 and minimum space needed is 3 MB. Up here, as you can see right here, 88% is available. Let's take this first option and see what happened to our initial size. Remember, our initial size is 20 MB. I'm going to go ahead and tell it, okay, I made a mistake to give you initial size 20 MB. What I want is, I want to grab all that 20 MB back, or at least 15 MB out of that. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you that release unused space, since you're using just 3 MB, which right here it shows. So go ahead and give me all the space but this 3 MB, what you need, or 5 or 4 MB, whatever that you need. So when I click on this, click OK. Let's go back and see on files. As you can see right here, is it went back and it made to 4 MB. So let's look at the initial size again. We're gonna go ahead and go to the properties. Now remember, initial size we had set 20 MB and now it's back to 4 MB. So this is what I wanted to explain. A lot of folks really don't understand that what it means, because sometimes DBA has intention to give more space than in initial, and it's a good practice to do that if you can afford more space, because for the same reason that I explained in the first video in best practices. So sometimes it's not a good idea to just use the release unused space. Now let's say that you have to basically I'm going to, let me go ahead and do the initial size again, 20 MB, because it makes it more understandable. Now let's say that you really do have to bring some of the space back. Let's say it's a data, so you're gonna go ahead and click on reorganize pages before releasing unused space. So 20 MB, let's say that was a mistake, 20 MB, you really meant 10 MB, you didn't mean 20 MB or 20 gig. So we're gonna go ahead, and we know that minimum it needs 3 MB, so I'm going to give it 10 MB. 7 MB is enough for me. I really do need that space back for my other databases in the operating system. So we're gonna go ahead and click on 10 and click OK. Now keep in mind, when you do the data files, it takes time, so that's why I'm recommending you that if you wanted to do the shrink the data files, unless you have to do it during work hours, I would recommend you to do it off hours, and also make sure that you have basically truncated a lot of data, right amount of data from the database in order to shrink the data file. So let's go take a look, and as you can see right here is 10 MB, and free space is our 76%. So let's go ahead, this covers basically the data, and we're gonna go ahead and click on log. Log file, however, sometimes becomes more pain than the data files. First of all, my recommendation is never put data file and log file on the same drive, because log file does have a tendency to grow huge. So let's say that you wanted to shrink the log file right here in SQL Server 2008, 2012, and 2014. If you wanted to really shrink the log file, you need to bring the database into simple recovery mode. Or the better option, most recommended option, is that you go ahead and take your backup transactional log backup of that particular database, then shrink your log file. So my recommendation is always, if you can help it, please take the backup of your log, because if you bring the simple recovery and then bring it back to the full recovery, it's going to break up your backup chain, your transactional log backup chain. If you break the transactional log backup chain, then the previous transactions become really unusable. So my recommendation is always take the backup transactional log backup of that particular database and then shrink the log of that database. So let's say that I have done that and I'm going to use it right now. It says that I don't really need, I need just 0 right now. It's 1 MB, so I'm going to go ahead and do it on 0, and we're gonna go ahead and click OK. So let's go back and look at the behavior. Up here, as you can see that basically if you look at the properties right here, cancel file group options, up here is full. So if I do it simple recovery or bulk log recovery, when I do it, basically it does on its own, but it's such a little up here that it's 1 MB and 0 MB. If I do that, let me see now, 1 MB and 0 MB is not really going to make any difference. If it would be like really 10 MB, then it would have you would see that how much really a shrink file to is 1 MB. If we do it like it need 50 MB and we have the space that is currently allocated to that particular log file about 1 gig, then we will be able to see the difference. However, just to show you that how to shrink the log file, you come here and you go ahead and give your option. Right here is the minimum option it needs. It is not going to, let's say the minimum option up here, minimum requirement of that particular log is 10 MB. You will not be able to shrink less than 10 MB. It's going to always take 10 MB. So whenever you shrink the log file, give it like 15 MB or 5 MB more. So keep in mind the recommendation that I just discussed, that please take a backup and then shrink your log file. So we're gonna go ahead and cancel this, and we're gonna perform our second part of the question right here, which is using T-SQL script. I do have already this script created, so we're gonna go ahead and load those script. Up here I have a shrink database, which I was showing you. This is the percentage. This goes back to shrinking the database, this option. If you put up here that maximum free space in file after shrinking the database, that's that option. If you wanted to do 10%, you need to put 10%. If you need 80%, you need to put 80 right here. So I'm not going to run this command. I'm just wanted to show you. I will run the other commands. So let's go ahead and load the data up here. This is the database. Right here, at minimum it needs like 3 MB. So you can go ahead and do the 4 MB. So we're gonna go ahead and this dbcc shrink file is basically your command right here. Use the database that you wanted to basically shrink. So we're gonna go ahead and run this command. It's gonna take a little bit time, just like it did using graphic user interface. So right here are the results, as you can see. So we covered both options, and we covered some of the best practices right here, what I was talking about, that when it's a good idea to shrink database files, whether it comes to database or database data files or log files. And I hope this video helps.